Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar that's hosted by the Migration Policy Institute's National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy. My name is Margie McHugh. I'm the director of the center, and I'll be moderating today's session. We really appreciate the great interest that's been shown in this topic. We've got people spanning many time zones and even continents who are on the call. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of you, depending on where you currently are listening in from. Before we get going, I just want to go through a few of basic logistics for the call. So first of all, you can see here on the screen, if you have any problems accessing the webinar, you can reach us by email at events@migrationpolicy.org, or you can call us at 202-266-1929. We have people who are at the ready to answer any questions you might have or resolve any problems you might be having with the platform. Secondly, we really appreciate it if you use the chat function on the screen throughout the webinar to write your questions. It just helps, I guess it helps me in particular to line up and the different questions and see what are some of the similarities and kind of help us get through as many of them as possible. So please, it's never too early to be using that Q&A chat function. You can also email any questions to events@migrationpolicy.org, or you can tweet them to @migrationpolicy, #MPI discuss. And yes, we often get questions about whether the slides and the audio from the webinar are going to be available. So rest assured that they'll be up there on our website. You can see there, migrationpolicy.org/events. So as I said, I'm Margie McHugh, and my main role is moderating today's session. I'm stepping in for my colleague Delia Pompa, who's Senior Education Fellow with our center for many years now. She was pulled away at the last minute by an urgent matter. But we're happy that we've got Julie Sugarman, who is the lead author of the report that we'll be discussing today. And she's ready with all of her notes, and I think very pleased that we're finally getting this policy brief out into the universe. But I'll say a little more about her in a minute. I'll just say for myself that in addition to supervising the overall portfolios that exist within our center, I also focus a good deal in my other time on research, technical assistance, and capacity building efforts that are focused on early childhood education and care system building efforts and policies, and also in the workforce, adult education and workforce training arena, of course, all focused on immigrants and refugees and their families. Here's a quick look for any of you who might be new to our work. We have a very big investment in education pipeline issues, early childhood, K-16, adult ed, workforce development, language access, and also just trying to improve the governance of integration policy. If any of you have questions about that work, always happy to be in touch with you about any of those areas and your potential interest in them. So just in terms of setting up the conversation today about the policy brief that we're releasing, first of all, of course, it must be said that there's a lot else going on in the world right now that's affecting English learners and their families. And I'll just say that there's a great deal of work that's been underway in our shop, led by Julie and Delia and Melissa Lazarine, all looking at the impacts of the COVID-19, the move to remote instruction, the huge disparities that's been making more visible in terms of the experience of English learners, and also their families, who very often, their parents are essential workers and are very often not in the position to supervise home instruction, the way many other parents might be in a position to help out with big disparities in digital access, et cetera, et cetera. So rest assured that there's a lot going on in our shop around those, and we'd be happy to hear from any of you who are involved in that. We'll be getting out, we're trying to wrap together into one policy brief that will get out in about a month. What we've been dialoguing with folks at the federal level and on Capitol Hill about, as well as many folks who are in state education agencies or closer to the local level. So obviously, we've got one big crisis there affecting English learners. And then, of course, this is all unfolding. Everything that's been happening due to the pandemic has been unfolding now against the backdrop of the massive racial justice demonstrations that are seeking a dismantling of racist policing and other policies that have resulted in a lot of, in a long history of disparities, racial disparities, and really a lot of soul searching about what that means for policies going forward. So, all of these things are a huge part of the context right now, and this policy brief is really very tightly focused and specialized. And I'll just say that it's part of a body of work center that has always been looking at accountability for quality and relevance of instruction for English learner students. This is part of the ongoing questions around implementation of the country's governing education, K-12 education law, the Every Student Succeeds Act, and we've been working with a good number of you who are on the call or have been in conversation with you over the years around this issue about the use of native language assessments for English learners. And this piece that Julie's going to be talking about in a moment is very much just trying to explain the technical aspects of this particular issue. It gets down in the weeds around the implementation of that. But of course, we all know, any of us who have been working in the policy arena for a while know that the decisions about what happens when you really get closer to the ground in terms of trying to implement policy openings like this, that questions around what's offered to whom and what sort of capacity exists and what are the costs of doing these things, they all play into decision making, which is very much what was driving us in pulling together this particular brief. So I'm going to turn it over to Julie in a moment. Many of you are familiar with Julie's work. She's been a senior policy analyst with our center for a good number of years now, and she's tightly focused on issues related to immigrants and English learner students. And any of you who have followed her publications know that she's got one suite of products that's very much trying to explain for folks who are just coming into issues related to English learners what the overall policy and funding and legal context is for English learner instruction. And then at the same time, she's got a portfolio of work that goes much more deeply into key areas, deeper research into some of the really big questions that are very topical, both as a result of the Every Student Succeeds Act and other legal, issues in broad policy that we come up against, but then also just the same question of how differently things look because of state and local capacities for doing what we believe to be good practice, good policy and practice for actually meeting the needs of this very diverse population. So Julie, before I turn it over to you, let me say one more time, please everyone, send in your questions via either that events@migrationpolicy.org email account, tweet them to us, or please use the chat function. As Julie speaks, it would be great to be lining up questions so that we can make the best use of the time we have together. So with that, Julie, I think I still have control, and there you go. I'm switching it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Margie. And I'm really so glad to be able to share this work with you. I think it's as Margie said, it's a very technical, sort of wonky topic, but you know, the more you get into it, the more you see how it connects so many aspects of instruction and assessment and equity and all of the things that we really care about at a top level. So I'm going to talk about the sort of some of the technical aspects and the definitions up front here, but then we'll get into some of what it means and especially what it means right now with all of the other things going on. So let me start a little bit with some definitions. What are native language assessments? What we are talking about in this paper are tests of academic content, generally language arts, math, science, and social studies. And these are tests, native language assessments are given in the context of accountability systems, where at a broader level, students are in the US are tested in language arts and math every year from 3rd through 8th grade and once in high school, and then 3 times across that series of years in science. So, you know, we're talking about sort of a little bit of a narrow usage here of the term native language assessments, because we're not really talking about language proficiency assessments where it might tell you how well you speak Spanish or Chinese or a language like that. We're also not really going to get into the use of native language assessments for special education identification, although that is another really important issue and within the universe here of native language assessments. But what we're really focused on here is the use of these kinds of assessments relative to state accountability for school performance. And the way that we defined native language assessments are written or scripted oral translation, translation or scripted oral translations, or transadaptation. We'll get into what transadaptation means a little bit later, but the basic idea is that a translation is just a straight, translation from what it says in English to what it says in another language. A transadaptation is taking into consideration things about the language and the cultural background of students and that sort of thing. So it's not an exact word-for-word translation. And sometimes these tests may be designed from scratch. Also, they may not be direct translations. These native language assessments that we're talking about fit in a broader set of accommodations that exist for students taking tests, standardized tests. These include other kinds of native language supports and sometimes English supports, like dictionaries or clarifying. I will note that sometimes it's not clear what states mean or different systems mean when they're talking about, oh, we provide a native language assessment, but what they may mean is we provide a glossary of words that students might mean. So as Leslie Villegas, who I want to give a shout out to, who did amazing work bringing together what states were doing, as she and I were doing this work, we noticed that there were some times when states would say, we do this or we do that. And, if you dig in a little bit deeper, you have to really sort of figure out, are they talking about native language assessments in the same way? There's also accommodations that are used, and this is also true of students with disabilities, often get accommodations like this that modify the testing conditions. So very frequently an English learner would be allowed to take more time because it, of course, if they're taking a test in English, it would take more time than it would if they were a fluent English speaker to read the passages and answer the questions and so on. So those are some other kinds of accommodations that are part of the universe here. And really, the whole reason for offering accommodations is to ensure meaningful participation of all students. Because we want to make sure that if we're giving a student a test, that it's reflecting really what they know and can do, and that we're not measuring things that are outside the ideas that we want to actually know how, the academic content that we want to know that they've learned. So drawing from that, the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, as well as its predecessors, have laid out a number of guidelines around, obviously around assessment, but even around this issue of native language assessment, which is one of the reasons why we got interested in this, as ESSA was passed in 2015, and it sort of raised the issue and got people interested in native language assessments, since it was in one of the things that states had to account for in their plans. We'll get to that in a second. So in ESSA, as was true in No Child Left Behind, all students must be included in assessment. There's very few exceptions in terms of who can sit out. And the reason that was done is because for a long time, schools were really just testing a certain segment of students. They weren't testing English learners. They weren't testing students with disabilities. And it really sort of let them off the hook for how those students were doing. And we didn't really know how those students were doing. So the reason that accountability measures include all of these students now is to make sure that schools are held accountable for instruction, and so we can track the progress of different subgroups of students. And what it actually says in ESSA with regard to native language assessments is it suggests that English learners who are part of assessment systems should be assessed in the language and form most likely to yield accurate data. So it doesn't actually require the use of native language assessments, but it does suggest it strongly. And as part of the plans that states wrote for how they would comply with ESSA, they had to answer a few questions about what languages were spoken in their state and what native language assessments were available. So that's sort of the policy piece of why use native language assessments. Now, there hasn't been a lot of research on this. There's been some amount on accommodations more broadly, but there have been a few research studies that have looked specifically at native language assessments. And what it looks like the research is saying is that Spanish versions of reading and math tests improved results for English learners receiving instruction in Spanish and or with low English proficiency. So for students who are Spanish speakers, and it's just that these research pieces only looked at Spanish and they weren't meaning to exclude anyone else. It was just that was how the research was designed. So for this group of students who took tests in reading and math and were part of these studies, if they were instructed in Spanish and or if they were English learners with low English proficiency, having a native language assessment helped them do better and show what they knew in math and reading than comparable students who took those tests in English. Now, we don't know exactly, we don't have an exact cutoff of exactly what level of English proficiency or exactly how much instruction in what context. So, these are really still open questions that require quite a bit more research before we really know for sure who should be taking these. But it did, the research that we have that I'm referencing did show that students that were at higher levels of English proficiency and students who were being instructed only in English did not do better if they had a Spanish language assessment, even if they also knew Spanish, or spoke Spanish at home. So I think that's a really important piece of context. It's, again, it's not totally definitive. We don't know where the boundaries are, but there were several articles that did show this. Now, the other piece of this, of the use of native language assessments, and some of you knew me in my former life where I worked on dual language programs, and how important it is for instructional feedback and for equity purposes for students to be tested in both English and the partner language, the other language that's used in a dual language context. And so students who are English learners in those programs, and I think students who are fluent English speakers, who are no longer classified as English learners or maybe who never were, could benefit from taking native language assessments. This is, again, not something we have a ton of research on, but those of us who've spent a lot of time in the dual language education area have written for many, many years about the importance of making sure that students see that it's in, oh, we're taking a test in this, so it must be important. And also to have the information, if I studied math and Spanish, that I'm taking a test in Spanish to show how much I know about the math that I've learned in Spanish. So those are just a couple of lenses through which we should take a look at the research. So once a state is looking at whether it wants to offer a native language assessment as part of its accountability system, there's a lot of practical considerations. As I just mentioned a few minutes ago, which students obviously is a big consideration. Are we going to limit it to students at just lower English proficiency levels, or offer it to all students? Are we going to offer it to students no matter what their language of instruction is, or just to students who are getting instruction in their native language? Another important consideration is students with interrupted formal education, because we know that students who are coming in that are 2 or more years behind in their academic background, just giving them a test in their native language might not be the difference between passing or failing, because they may also not be that literate in their native language, and they may just not have the academic background to perform well. So, none of this, I'm not making any, proclamations about who should get things or who shouldn't get things, but just saying that it's very complicated. And so you have to sort of look at the different pieces of who these students are and what their background are in order to figure out which kinds of students should be taking native language assessments. We'll talk in a few minutes about, I'll show you which states are testing students in their native languages in which subjects. Math and science are the most common, which you'll see in a minute. Social studies, a few states do it. A bigger question has come up around language arts. I think it's clear to people, math is math, and if you translate a word problem into another language, you're really testing the math concepts. And, I think it's a little bit more clear to people how a translated math, science, or social studies test would work as opposed to language arts. Certainly the bigger question here, not, is a Spanish language arts assessment a useful thing? Because certainly in many contexts it would be. But the question is really, if a student is studying language arts in their native language and the language arts test is aligned to state standards in language arts, can we use that as our assessment of language arts for that student? So in other words, every student, again, as I said before, from 3rd to 8th grade and once in high school, is tested on their mastery of language arts standards. And so the question here is whether a test of native language arts can be equivalent or, should be used in place of an English language arts assessment for some or all students. The one thing I'll say about that is something that is very complicated, and I actually have yet to find a really, really good description of the distinction between language development and language arts. Language arts standards that students study are not necessarily about the language itself. There's a piece of that is language specific, but really if you look at a set of language arts standards, the vast majority of those standards are going to be about the use of language. So how does an author get their main point across? What does irony look like in this situation? How do you compare and contrast? Those things go across language. So you could talk about those kinds of standards. You could demonstrate your knowledge of those standards in any language. And that's why a lot of folks are looking to these native language arts assessments as being equivalent to an English language arts test, and that they should be offered as an alternative to an English language arts test for students that would just simply not be able to demonstrate their knowledge of language arts standards in English because their English proficiency isn't quite there yet. Another practical consideration is which languages. ESSA required states to list which languages were present to a significant extent, and states were allowed to define what that meant to them. So the expectation was set that it would be that, it would be reasonable to offer native language assessments in languages present to a significant extent. But you do, as a policy question, have to consider what about everybody else? And, if we do it, for Spanish, which is in most states the greatest number of students, what are we offering in terms of accommodations for other students? So we get into some issues there as well. I don't want to get too deeply in the design issues. We do talk a little bit about translation versus transadaptation in the paper. So if you want to know more about that, you can check that out there. But there are a number of questions in terms of the design, thinking about what is the level of equivalence between the English and the native language version. And there's various solutions around that. Again, I don't want to go down that road too far right now. And another question is whether you will present bilingual or monolingual. So a native language assessment could be something where you have, if it's a paper test, you have Spanish on the left and English on the right. Now, a lot of these tests have now moved online, and we'll talk more about that as well. But since students are taking their tests on computers now anyway, a lot of them have these options to toggle back and forth between English and Spanish. So instead of seeing them simultaneously, one on one side and one on the other, you could read a question and decide, oh gosh, I don't really understand that. Let me read that in my native language, and click something and read it in your native language and then answer the question. And then of course, another design question is whether for open-ended questions, multiple choice, you just click the option, but if it's open-ended, will students be allowed to answer in their native language or not? So that's just another question that comes up. Implementation, once you've made the decision to offer this and laid out your rules about who will be eligible, you still need a process for schools to identify those students. And, there's always going to be edge cases, so states may want to provide guidance on how schools can make those decisions about who should take it. Decisions around reporting results. If the native language assessment is considered to be technically equivalent to the English version, you can combine the results of the native language and English versions, but it may also be interesting to report them separately. And there may be other things that need to be done in the background with regard to reporting to ensure that things are equivalent. So again, we get that more into that in the paper, but I just wanted to raise those as issues. And of course, the issue that we always worry about is capacity and cost. These assessments require resources for developing and for scoring. It can vary a lot depending on how, which subject it is and in how many languages. And I mean, the cost burden varies enormously here, but it certainly is, an important thing to take into consideration for states that are looking to offer these native language assessments. So with that, I just want to show you the map that we have showing. This is mostly based on what states reported in their ESSA plans, but with a little bit of checking up afterwards. In terms of what states offer native language assessments. In the upper left-hand corner, you can see the map showing which offer math tests in a native language. 31 states plus DC offer math, and 21 of those also offer science. So those two are links there, and you can see that the most states that offer native language assessments, it's in math and science. A few states offer a native language assessment in social studies, and 4 states offer native language assessments in reading or language arts. Only Colorado is the only state that offers all 4 of those domains. The other thing I wanted to mention is that most of these states, we go into more detail on the languages that are offered. Most of these states offer tests only in Spanish, but there are 3 states, Michigan, New York, and Washington, that offer tests in multiple languages. And then there's several states that Hawaii offers assessments in Hawaiian as part of its Hawaiian language revitalization program, and a couple other states that we found have there isn't a concordance between the language that was present to a significant extent and the language that they offer, which is Spanish. So for the most part, what's offered is Spanish. The other reason that math is so frequently offered is because a lot of these states that you see in the upper left side use one of the shared assessments, PARC or Smarter Balanced, and those two organizations offer their test as a Spanish version. So it's sort of easy for states to opt in, and in fact, all of the states that use those math tests do allow students to take them in Spanish, and why wouldn't they? Because it's something that's easy, again, for them to opt into. So that's sort of the lay of the land of which states are offering native language assessments. I know a lot of states are having conversations right now, or maybe were up until a few months ago, about deepening their use or starting to use more. Florida, California, Illinois, I know were all states where those conversations were happening. So there's a lot of interest in this, I think, and people will be wanting, moving forward, to continue to have that conversation about whether their state is offering a native language assessment and how they can increase that.
Thanks, Julie. And thanks everyone who has been writing in with additional questions. So Julie, I think first of all, everybody, those of you who are joining with the screen, you can see events@migrationpolicy.org, or you can tweet questions to @migrationpolicy, #MPI discuss. But so Julie, just a few very quick questions just that are kind of frame setting. The first is, are we talking about formative, interim, summative assessments? And was the research based on public schools or were private or charter schools included, and or pre-K? So maybe just do a quick top line about, the definition, I guess, that the types of assessments that we're talking about.
Right. We're talking here about the summative end-of-year exams in language arts, math, science, and social studies. And so it really is, this project came out of other work that we were doing on ESSA and on ESSA plans. Every state had to submit a plan talking about how its practices would align with the new law. And this was one of the things that came up. And so that was really what got us interested in working on this. So what we're talking about is whether states are offering this at all. And I should mention, just because a state offers it doesn't mean every jurisdiction within that state does. Private schools don't take these tests at all, so that's sort of out. But with any accommodation, there's no requirement that you must offer any particular thing. The state will say, we allow the following things, and they'll give you a whole long laundry list. But then as a district or as a school or as an individual teacher, you decide what is appropriate for any individual student. So if you're in a state that has one of these and you haven't ever seen it and you don't know why your students aren't taking it, that's another question for you to ask.
Right, and that, I would just go back to what I was saying earlier, that that our shop has a big interest in the accountability provisions of ESSA, and that, basically we're talking about the types of assessments that are required for accountability purposes under ESSA. So Julie, I just think given the kind of the uproar about what we've all seen with the pandemic, let me just draw from some of the questions and quickly ask you about to take a quick peek around the corner, if you can, looking ahead. So we've been hearing that because of the shutdown, I hope it's not like the first shutdown and we're going for another shutdown. But you know, given that we had this period of shutdown due to the virus and state tax receipts fell so tax and other receipts fell so dramatically, there's a lot of kind of ominous talk about the budget cuts that we might be in for next year, and well, at least next year. But anyway, given you've talked a little bit about how creating and administering the native language assessments can be relatively resource intensive. Do you have anything, is there something you can share about how to think about positioning an ask like this, you know, in a time of potential cuts in state budgets generally and in K-12 in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just to set the context a little bit, it's not clear what will be the status of assessment and accountability. This past year, for anyone who doesn't know, states were allowed not to give any of these tests. We're not talking about the English language proficiency, which is something else, but the tests of language arts, math, science, and social studies, no state gave their end of year test in this year. And of course, we really don't know what's going to happen next year. We don't know if these will be offered next year or not. So the question of timing, of course, comes up because this may or may not be an issue for the immediate next year. But, you know, I think on the one hand, we do have to have some hard conversations about priorities. I mean, clearly, you know, there's a pretty big contingent of folks who are very laser focused on providing resources and prioritizing resources in the classroom. And I definitely think that is an appropriate conversation for us to be having right now. And you know, it is a little bit hard to think about something, you know, again, the scope of the resources needed varies. But, you know, but on the other hand, if we're going to have an assessment system, it needs to be fair. And I think that this is a really important piece of what goes into a fair and accurate accountability system. So there's ways that states can maybe collaborate together as they've done with the PARCC and Smarter Balanced Math tests. You know, are there ways that they can collaborate to create native language assessments in other areas? Are there foundations that might be able to support some of these translations? I think there's things that we can do as we ask about these to help states see the feasibility in addition to just the difficulty and the resources needed.
All right, well, so I can hear already, even before you write, some of you who wrote in your questions, because there's a cluster of questions that relate to broadly to civil rights issues, kind of, you know, that I think are both related to native language assessments and just sort of language of instruction more broad, or nature of instruction for ELs more broadly. So I guess like this might be a longer podcast or something that we should do with you, Julie. But so kind of the questions go from like, you know, isn't there a fairness issue that these are done for some languages and not for others? What if I'm in an area, you know, or in a jurisdiction where like no native language assessment at all is offered? Like, how is that like possible and legal? And then also, you know, if you're in a state that requires all instruction to be in English, like how do we take the civil rights frame we normally have and kind of apply it in this context where it does seem like, I don't want to say it's like a bit of a free-for-all, but like it does seem that there's really not a floor of kind of equal treatment in terms of the use of native language assessments. So like, can you just give us a quick explanation of the raggedy edges of what we see here?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, the issue of doing things in Spanish and not others, like I said, I had this previous life of working in dual language, and this came up all the time of why should we have dual language programs in Spanish when we can't do them in all languages? And, you know, my answer would be, that's a great question. You know, I think that it is, I think we do what we can. And clearly you do need to have, there are cost considerations, there are, you know, considerations of all kinds of considerations that would say that, if we only have one or two speakers of a language, it just doesn't make sense to create a translated assessment for them. And it's not fair, but we have a system, we have a society where we have limited resources for education, and that's kind of where we are, and we do just have to have those really hard conversations. In terms of districts not offering it if the state does, yeah, I think this is, the actual implementation is really unclear. We don't have any data on how many kids actually take these tests. We don't know whether, there's really, I'm not going to enumerate it because there's basically nothing that we know about it. So what you're seeing here on the screen with the maps is kind of what we know. We just don't have any of that information. And so we don't know, how many districts are not doing this. It's a little bit swept under the rug, to be frank, and it's just not something that's been, one of the reasons I'm glad we're doing this is just to bring it to people's attention that this exists, because I think it's not known. And then just really quickly on the English-only laws. Yes, there are laws in a number of states saying that education will only be in English, but there are also civil rights issues around language access, and that states or agencies that get money from the federal government, which obviously all public schools do, have an obligation to ensure that that language issues are not a boundary or not a barrier to understanding. And so, there really hasn't been any kind of a formal ruling on it, but it does seem like the education instruction is one thing, but the assessment, having a native language assessment or native language accommodations is really an accommodation for something that you are requiring all students in school to do. So, this has not been tested, and I am not a lawyer, so we gotta maybe look into this a little bit more, but I do think there are states that are, you see on the map, states that we know that are maybe less friendly to bilingual education that are doing it. So it can be done.
So Julie, I want to shoehorn in a quick question, a question that I think might have a quick answer, and then one that might be a slightly longer one. And there are a number of questions that that we'll also respond to individually offline, because some of them were very specific to particular state context. But first of all, one of the questions was, why do you think that so few of the states have social studies? But then the other bigger topic is, with the pandemic and maybe even, not just what was already moved online, and you addressed that a little bit about, like, who knows a little bit with what we're coming into in September. But if we are going to move even more quickly towards the use of computer-based learning and assessment, what do you think? What do you like? Where do you see opportunity there, or do you see, how much opportunity and how much danger? So anyway, just quickly social studies, and then the kind of move towards more computer-based learning and assessment. Is there an opening there, or is it mostly danger?
Yeah, absolutely. The reason that so few do social studies is that social studies is not a required subject to test. A number of states do offer a social studies test and use that as part of their accountability system, but many states do not. So, students may or may not be taking tests, but if they don't count. Well, I think in most states, students are taking end-of-year tests in social studies, but if they don't count for accountability, that just sort of doesn't fall under the, the aegis of what they were talking about in their ESSA plans. I think the issue of technology is really interesting, and I think that really is one of the other reasons why it's important not to lose sight of this issue as oh boy, this is too big to think about right now. We have way too many other things, because I think a lot of things are going to really move in the next year with regard to online learning, and I think this is one of the issues that we really need to keep an eye on. And there are concerns about technology and English learners more broadly, and we can talk about that another time. But I think with regard just to this narrow issue, technology is really unlocking a potential for ways to incorporate native language support and native language assessments. As I mentioned, with a toggle option, there may be ways that native language assessments can be done more easily and more seamlessly as we get more technology. Another thing that's happening right now is there's been talk in recent years of moving away from a single end-of-year exam and having more ongoing assessment be part of the accountability system. And we can debate whether or not that's a good idea, but I do think that is something that people, not just in the EL world, but all over the education world, have been talking about, and something I think we'll hear more about. So if that happens, then the question is, okay, so if we are going to have a lot more online learning, what are the opportunities for having instruction and activities and assessment in native languages? And how can we build that in from the beginning, as opposed to letting the tech train get 10 years down the road and then saying, oh, by the way, why don't we translate some of these things? But, it would be good to think about them up front. The slightly less optimistic part of that is that it could end up being even more prohibitively expensive to do this. States may say, we're okay translating one test a year, or one test times 4 domains and how many grades. We're okay with translating one test per year, but if we're going to have all of these computer adaptive tests, and that's a huge amount to be translating, and that could end up being a conversation that's a little bit harder to have. But again, I think that's just something that we need to be keeping our eyes on, both from the instructional point of view and from the assessment point of view, as we get more further down the road with regard to online and computer-based learning.
So, and Julia, I'm just thinking with where you ended up with that to me at least it's interesting. This isn't, I don't spend a lot of my time in K-12, but it does strike me that there's been some interesting kind of movement and advocacy even from folks in academia, as well as, some of the other professional organizations that folks would expect. But the state contexts are just so different, and the making things happen is usually such a state level kind of game, quote unquote, that I think it might be interesting just looking at the questions that we will be answering personally on email for those of you whose questions we haven't gotten to, and since we're a bit over time now. But it does seem like this is an area where there are things are on the move in a number of states, and where it might be helpful to be sharing more across states around how folks are moving the issue forward, trying to have more equitable approaches as well that touch on a number of different language groups, and then particularly that we might expect to see a lot of new dynamics in what's funded in K-12 and how people are thinking about it post the pandemic, and so just feels very much like an area to watch. But so anyway, I just want to thank all of you, not just for joining, but like everybody. I mean, it's a huge number of people who stayed till the very end. So we really, obviously, that's a great sign of interest, and we'd love to stay in touch, and we will absolutely get back to those of you whose questions we didn't get to. And so in the meantime, you can see on the screen how to access this. The bit.ly is up there. Everything will be up on our website, migrationpolicy.org/events or /integration. And in the meantime, just thanks to all of you, not just for your interest, but for the great work that we know you're all doing and trying to do on behalf of immigrant and English learner kids in the various systems or state contexts you're working in. So Godspeed to everyone with the work that they're doing. And Julie, thanks for a great presentation. And again, we'll make sure to be in touch with anybody whose questions we didn't get to in this portion of the webinar. Take care, everyone. Thanks again. Signing off.